Thank you, Leonard. It's indeed a pleasure to be here. It's always a great honor to be in a room where Professor Leal is, and I run over here immediately when I know, in fact, he will be here. It's my understanding that I first get to introduce Professor Mario Garcia, who will introduce Professor Leal, which means certainly age is coming before beauty. Professor Garcia is one of our most distinguished faculty and an author of numerous books and other publications, and he's been on this faculty for many years, actually since 1975, with a short visit to another institution, and we were happy to have him back. He's been a good colleague and confidant and scholar at this university, and it's always been a pleasure to work with him. He has won numerous awards for his work, including many prestigious fellowships, including a Guggenheim Award, which is given to very, very few people. And he's also won the Southwest Book Award, not once, not twice, not 3 times, not 4 times, but 5 times. And I think that's a remarkable achievement. Mario's work is incredibly well known, both nationally and internationally, and he has always been a good friend and colleague. I wish I could have had the honor of introducing Professor Leal, but I think just being here in his presence makes my day and my week. So without any further comments, let me introduce Professor Mario Garcia. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you very much, Ed. I do have the pleasure of later in the program to introduce Professor Leal, but I also want to, before, just thank the organizers, again, the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center, Leonard Wallach specifically, the co-sponsors, the Department of Chicano Studies, the Center for Chicano Studies, Department of History, Department of Spanish and Portuguese, the Latin American and Iberian Studies, UCSB bookstore. By the way, I don't expect my students to have to buy the book. You've bought enough books already for my class, so it's not expected, unless you really want to. I'm not going to hold you back. And then finally, the University of Texas Press, which is also one of the co-sponsors and the publisher of the book entitled Luis Leal, an Auto/Biography. What I'm going to do first is talk a little bit about Professor Leal, and then through the aid of some slides, take you through a bit of his life and career. And then I'm going to be in the process reading a little bit of the selections from the book itself. But let me talk a little bit about the nature of the book. This is an oral history, testimonio, a life story. Professor Leal is more than capable, given his distinguished career, to write his own autobiography. However, because he has had such a busy career in researching and writing so many books and articles, that I felt that he might not have the time to do that. So I approached him back in 1993 with the idea of sitting down and doing a number of interviews to talk about his life and his career, and he very graciously accepted. And we worked from about 1993 to just last year, 1999, in a total of about anywhere between 35 to 40 hours over the period of time. Wonderful opportunities to, I felt like I was in a one-on-one seminar with Professor Leal, learning about Mexican history, Mexican culture, Mexican literature, Latin American literature, Chicano literature, all of these things. It was a wonderful, in his modest, wonderful home here in Goleta with Gladys, his wife of so many years, interrupting us only to bring us little panecitos, little baked goods for our little break, and cafecito and some coffee. We would work from maybe a couple of hours at each session, but he took me through this wonderful panorama of history and culture that it was a tremendous learning process for me. So this book is his life story, but I play with the word autobiography and biography, and so the book, the subtitle is an autobiography, but auto/biography. But basically, we suggest that this is not a traditional autobiography that is written by the subject himself, nor is it a traditional biography in which I write not through interviews but through research and documents the life story of the subject. This is really a kind of an intersection of autobiography and biography. So through interviews, through oral history, put together his life story and and what his life and career was all about, hence the term auto/biography. The book itself is published as a dialogue, as a conversation between me and Professor Leal, or Don Luis as we affectionately refer to him. The book is published as a conversation, which I felt worked best in the sense of some of the subjects that we covered, because even though we do cover aspects about his personal life, it's also very heavily focused on his career, on his research projects, on the numerous writers and critics from both sides of the border that he's known for so many years. As some of you know, Professor Leal just finished celebrating on September 17th his 93rd birthday, which is an incredible achievement in and of itself. And in the book, we talk a little bit about why the longevity of his life and what's the secret of it and so forth. And he always tells me on the side that it's that cervecita that he has every day at dinner, you know, the beer that he has. But anyway, the book is published as a dialogue, and we cover many subjects and so forth, and there's no way that we can, in this short period of time, give full coverage to that, but I will read a few selections from here and there. Of course, here you have the cover, and this is an image of Professor Leal at age 19 in Mexico, just before he came to the United States a year later. But the book deals with his early history, his early years in northern Mexico, in the state of Nuevo León. He was born in 1907 in a small town called Linares in Nuevo León, in the northern state in Mexico. And his family was of a ranching family, and they experienced the Mexican Revolution of 1910, and then Professor Leal decided to come and study in the United States later in the 1920s. And I will talk a little bit more as we go through some of this presentation. So the book deals, covers it chronologically, but as I say, covers a whole range of cultural, historical, and literary subjects. I mean, the list of writers, for example, that we talk about and discuss is like a who's who of prominent writers on both sides of the border. For example, on the Mexican side, Mariano Azuela, Samuel Ramos, Octavio Paz, Carlos Fuentes, Jorge Luis Borges, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Julio Cortázar, Mario Vargas Llosa. On the U.S. side, for example, Chicano writers such as Tomás Rivera, Alurista, Rodolfo Anaya, Rolando Hinojosa, Oscar Zeta Acosta, John Reschi, Estela Portillo Trampley, Elena Poniatowska. Well, on the Mexican side, Richard Rodriguez, Sandra Cisneros, Ana Castillo, Denise Chavez. All of these writers are mentioned in the book as we engage in our conversation, and Don Luis discusses his views of these writers, his interpretation of them, and so forth and so on. This is a more recent picture, a wonderful picture, a very pensive picture of Don Luis that we also use in the book. Captures the more pensive side, I suppose, of Don Luis. Here we have Don Luis on the right at about age 2 with his younger brother Jose in Linares in Nuevo León. Here he is at about age 2.5. Let me say, for those of you that are less acquainted with Professor Leal, Professor Leal is one of the leading scholars, one of the leading critics of Mexican, Latin American, and Chicano literature. He's published over 40 books in his career, numerous, hundreds of articles, read hundreds of papers at scholarly presentations, at conferences, and so forth. Taught at major institutions. Since 1976, when he came to ostensibly retire here at UCSB, we very quickly gobbled him up and started having him teach. To this day, as I've told my students in my class, he still teaches 2 classes for us each year in the Department of Chicano Studies. He'll teach a class this coming winter quarter on border literature. So he still remains active and continues to write and publish. And maybe that also with the cervecita is the reason for his longevity, that he remains very, very active. But he is a major figure, a role model for all of us as a teacher, as a scholar, as a human being. He's always been active in the communities, even when, for example, he was studying in Chicago. He was active in Mexican-American organizations there. Here in Santa Barbara, he's been active in cultural and educational endeavors and so forth. So he's just a wonderful example of the best of being an intellectual, being a professor, of being a scholar, and we can all look up to him. And I hope that many of you as students will have time to take an opportunity to take classes with him because it's a rare opportunity. It is a privilege to be in one of Professor Leal's class. So the reason that I chose to do this book is because of who he is and the caliber of individual that he is and his standing as a major intellectual of Mexican background in the United States. We have not had many studies that deal with the history of intellectuals of Mexican background in the United States. This is one of the first, and in that sense, it really gives us some idea of the development of a Mexican intelligentsia, if you will, on this side of the border. So for all of these reasons, plus my own personal affection for Don Luis, I felt it was important to put in book form his life, his career, his feelings, his experiences about a whole range of issues. This is Don Luis at 2.5. Here he is with his father. Don Luis here is about 1912, at age 12. I want to pause here and read you a little bit in our conversations about his growing up in Linares in the northern Mexican state of Nuevo León, just to give you a flavor of the dialogue and the body of the text in the book itself. He for example, commented to me, we lived in a very large home. It occupied an entire block. It was typical Spanish-style house with an interior central patio, surrounded by the various rooms in the kitchen. I had my own bedroom as a child. Much of our time was spent in and around the patio. Linares was a very small town. It had its central square with its church and marketplace. In the evening, families and the young men and women would go to the central plaza. There, the young men and women would participate in the serenata, which consisted of the young men and women, of the young men walking around the plaza in a clockwise direction, and the young women in a counterclockwise one. Many of you have seen that. Maybe you even participated in that. This tradition goes back to Spain and was a way for young people to socialize with each other, but still be under the eyes of watchful parents or elders. As a parent, I can relate to that. Boys and girls never walked together unless they were engaged. I remember by around age 15 walking with my male friends and looking and smiling at the girls. The girls would walk on the inside and the boys on the outside of the plaza. This would take place for an hour or two each evening of the week. I also remember attending as a young man dances at the casino. This was not a gambling casino, but the central social hall in Linares. It was designed by Germán Leal, my father's brother, and was 2 blocks from our home. This is where the traditional, more middle-class families socialized. At these dances, the young women would sit on one side of the hall and the young men on the other side. That sounds very foreign to us now. I didn't have a girlfriend, but I enjoyed dancing with all of the girls. Don Luis still enjoys dancing. A band would play, and we would dance a variety of dances, including the Charleston. I'd love to see that with Don Luis, Charleston. Other dances would include boleros, waltzes, and the tangos. I never took dancing lessons. I just observed and learned. Another thing that I remember about the casino was that it contained the very first radio in Linares. My uncle Germán had bought it in the early 1920s. There was no local station in Linares, so we listened to the ones in Monterrey. People would stop by the casino to hear the news. And then I asked him later on, my question to him was, what stands out the most about your childhood activities? And his response was, the carpas, or the traveling circus, when it came to town. I would always go, especially I liked the one-act plays, something like the actos of the later Teatro Campesino and Luis Valdez. One particular circus I'll never forget because my shirt caught on fire. Somehow someone threw a match while I was standing in front of the tent entrance, and it landed on my shirt, setting it on fire. I was close to home, so I ran there on fire. My mother quickly put it out before I was seriously hurt. I'll never forget this. One other attraction of growing up in Linares was going to the local movie house, which by the early 1920s was showing American silent movies. I liked all of them, but especially the comical ones, such as those featuring Charlie Chaplin. Besides American films, the theater also showed a few Italian ones, which were very popular in Mexico. All of the films would be shown about 3 times a week, including weekends. And then I asked him later on about his relationship with his father and his mother. And I asked him, what was your relationship with your father? And his response was, it was a wonderful relationship. He always wanted me to learn and to improve. By the time I had learned to read in school, my father always made sure that I read at home. He would have me read part of the newspaper each evening. This was El Porvenir from Monterrey. He would then have me discuss what I had read with him. This practice went on for most of my childhood. Reading was very much a part of my home life. My father had lots of books. Many were technical books, but he also possessed many 19th century Spanish novels. At one point, he bought for us children an encyclopedia. I remember being fascinated by it and reading many of the entries, as well as being impressed by the pictures. When I was 14 or 15, I read most all of Don Quixote on my own outside of school. I loved it and was particularly attracted to the humor of the novel. Much later in my career, when I formally studied it and taught it, I appreciated many other aspects of this great classic. But in my youth, it was the humor that I liked. In fact, I would read a part of Quixote to my younger siblings in the afternoons when we returned from school. They would laugh at the humor. And what was your relationship with your mother like, Don Luis? I asked him, and he said, just as wonderful. She was a loving mother. She and my grandmother, Mama Lola, were very religious, very Catholic. My mother would read the catechism to us once a week. We accompanied her to Mass every Sunday. My father, however, didn't go to Mass. He wasn't anti-religious, but he just didn't go to church. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 affected the family. They had to leave Linares. They spent some time in the capital, in the capital, in Mexico City until the revolution subsided. And then they returned. Don Luis finished his early education there. But then in the 1920s, as he was growing up, and he also did some homeschooling with his own father, who was took on the role of his teacher as well. But later in the 1920s, some of his friends in Linares started to matriculate to United States, and specifically to Chicago, to study at Northwestern University. And Don Luis in time followed them later in the 1920s. So around 1927, Don Luis leaves Linares and comes to the United States, and therefore his life, crosses borders, that kind of trans-border experience that affects so many people of Mexican background. So in this part of the book, we talk about his initial experiences in the Midwest, specifically in Chicago and at Northwestern University. And I asked him, for example, what do you recall about your initial journey to Northwestern, which is a very prestigious private institution just outside of Chicago? And he said, I was 19 and ready to go. There he is, 19. I was 19 and ready to go. My father accompanied me to Monterrey. From there, I was on my own. I took the train to San Antonio and then transferred to the Missouri Pacific Line to St. Louis. There, I changed to the Chicago and Alton Railroad, which took me into Chicago. During the trip, I had difficulty ordering a meal due to my very limited English. I would go into the club car, be seated, and then just point to an item, any item, on the menu, actually on the menu. Somehow I got by. Where did you first live? On campus or on campus? And he said, I moved in with friends from Linares. They were renting rooms in a boarding house off campus managed by a Mexican family by the name of Morales, who were from Leon, Guanajuato. They had come to Chicago a few years before to work. They had either bought this house or were renting. It was on the north side of Chicago, not far from Evanston, where Northwestern is located. How did you learn English, Don Luis? My friends helped me. I read, or I tried to read on my own. I sat in on classes, including ones on English phonics. I went to the movies and concentrated on the subtitles until the talkies appeared. And then I listened to the dialogue. Little by little, my English improved until after a few years, I began to take classes in math, science, English, and other undergraduate courses. After I was formally enrolled, I even took a course on Shakespeare. But it took me 7 years to master English, which is why I didn't complete my BA until 1940. So it took him several years, more than the usual 4 years. And I asked him, what was the most difficult thing about learning English? And he said, the pronunciation. I found that learning to read English was not as difficult as learning to speak it. Even after half a century, I still have problems with pronunciation. Writing English was not that difficult. And then I asked him, was Northwestern in Chicago a big change from Linares? And he said, it was a tremendous change. The idea I had of Chicago before arriving there did not coincide with what I found. I had visualized something entirely different, something more modern. I had seen the film Metropolis in the 1920s and thought Chicago was a futuristic city of the type presented in that film. But this is not what I found. There were slums. There was much poverty. This should resonate with my students in my seminar. We just finished reading Black Boy by Richard Wright, which is partly set in Chicago in the 1930s. There were slums. There was much poverty. Of course, this was during the Great Depression. If you were downtown, you would see people selling apples. On the south side, there were the black ghettos. All this was a shock to me. I also didn't care for the cold weather. So Don Luis goes to Northwestern as an undergraduate and struggles with English, as he says, but eventually is able to graduate. During the course of this time, around 1936, he is introduced and he gets to know Gladys Clemens, his wife, who he will marry at that time, and they have now had a 50-year-plus relationship that is a wonderful relationship with Gladys. And so I asked him, one of the big changes in your life while at Northwestern was that you got to marry Gladys. What year did you get married? And he said it was 1936. I had met Gladys, whose family name was Clemens, at Northwestern, where she was also a student. She was from Chicago, a third-generation German-American. Her grandmother still spoke German. Meeting and eventually marrying Gladys also helped me with my English. She still helps him with his English, too. Has translated, as a matter of fact, some of his articles from Spanish to English. At this time also, Don Luis, here he is in Chicago when he first arrives. It was cold. It was cold. And this brings us up to World War II. One of the things in the late 30s, after he marries Gladys, Don Luis also becomes a U.S. citizen. And by this time, he's decided he's going to pursue a career in higher education here in the United States. But one of the things about becoming citizen is that it also made him subject to the draft when the war broke out in 1941. So Don Luis is called into service. And in this section, he talks about his World War II experience. And here you see him in military uniform. And I asked him, Don Luis, tell me now about when you went to war. How did it happen? He said, I was drafted in 1943 during World War II. My department wrote a letter. At this time, he was already in his graduate work at the University of Chicago, another prestigious institution. He first did his MA at the University of Chicago in Romance languages and then continued his PhD work. But his PhD work was interrupted by the war. So he says, my department, speaking of his department at the University of Chicago, wrote a letter to my draft board that I was needed for instructional purposes. But the draft board said no, so I was drafted. One of the ironies of becoming a U.S. citizen a few years before was that it made me eligible to be drafted into the U.S. Armed Forces. My oldest son, Antonio, was born in 1942, but having a family didn't defer you from the draft. Were you drafted into the Army? Yes, although you had a choice of selecting what service you preferred. However, during my initial medical examination, it was discovered, this was news to me too, it was discovered that I was colorblind. I didn't know this myself. I could be put only into the Army because of my color blindness. I was sent to Camp Blanding in Florida for my initial training. I was then sent to Fort Ord in California in preparation for my units being sent to the Pacific. Gladys and my son stayed, of course, in Chicago. They moved in with her mother. We were put on a huge passenger ship that was being used to transport troops. We embarked from San Francisco. There were 10,000 soldiers on this ship. We went all the way down without escort to South America. From there, we crossed the Pacific, first to an island close to Australia, and then on to New Guinea. Here we stayed for 6 months. This is interesting because Don Luis was part of an experience that hasn't been very well told. 500,000 Mexican Americans fought in World War II, and they fought bravely. What struck me, outraged me in some ways, a recent book by Tom Brokaw, the NBC newsreader, who wrote a book about experiences in World War II. There's not a single Mexican American interviewed for that book, and yet 500,000 Mexican Americans, including Don Luis, fought in that war. That's a story that desperately needs to be really told, and told much more thoroughly. And so I asked Don Luis, he said, we were put on a huge passenger ship that was being used to transport troops. We embarked from San Francisco. I said, we crossed the Pacific, first to an island close to Australia, and then on to New Guinea. Had New Guinea already been taken by the U.S. from Japan, I asked him, and he said yes. This had occurred a little before we arrived. Many Americans died in the Battle of New Guinea. We would see all of the Japanese prisoners. From New Guinea, we prepared for the invasion of the Philippines. We landed with General MacArthur in the Philippines. It was a horrible experience. Many Americans died. Many ships were sunk. When we landed on one of the smaller islands, we came under heavy bombardment. In fact, a big bomb landed right on the transport boat I was on. Fortunately, it didn't go off. Then a kamikaze plane came in and missed us by a few feet. I was lucky that nothing happened. And what about when you landed? It was awful. We were bombed every day, every night until Christmas. From October when we landed until Christmas, we were bombed. Everybody was wounded except me. I was very lucky. So it took a long time to retake the Philippines. Yes, several months. We went from one island to another. There are many islands of the Philippines. We finally landed and took the main island of Luzon, including Manila. Did some of your friends die? Yes, some of them, especially when we landed. Fortunately, nothing happened to me. The irony here is that many from my unit received Purple Hearts for being wounded. I was one of the few that didn't get a Purple Heart because he was never wounded. What happened after the taking of the Philippines? We began to prepare for the invasion of Japan. In the meantime, we stayed in the Philippines. One benefit of this was that I had the opportunity while a student to have read some Philippine literature. So I knew some of the writers. I met some of them while on the islands. I was also impressed to see the many statues there dedicated to the great Philippine writer, Jose Rizal. He was a great hero because he had written novels against Spain before 1898 and the Spanish-American War, which transferred the islands to U.S. possessions. So he goes on and talks more about his experiences in World War II. Finally, he comes back, not wounded, but also not decorated in terms of Purple Heart, but he had put in his service, and he was one of those courageous Mexican Americans and Americans who went and fought the so-called Good War in World War II. He returns to Chicago, returns to his PhD work, and I believe we have a few more shots of him in the military. Here he is in New Guinea. Does anyone guess where Don Luis is? Well, he's to the top left. He's the tall man there. There's Don Luis to the left side of the picture. He comes back, resumes his PhD work, which he now concludes in 1950 from the University of Chicago in Romance Languages. And here he is receiving his doctorate with Gladys in 1950. He stays teaching there for a couple of years, and then in 1952 he receives his first formal appointment at the University of Mississippi, and is there a few years. He remembers running into William Faulkner walking the streets and so forth, but it's a teaching assignment that he is never particularly comfortable. There's the race problems in the South and so forth and so on. And so when he gets an opportunity to move, he gets an offer to go to Emory University in Atlanta, and there teaches there in the middle and later part of the 1950s, and this is where he begins to write and to do a lot of his research. He becomes one of the principal scholar in terms of the Mexican short story, begins to publish books in this area as well as on a variety of other topics. So in the 1950s, he's at Mississippi, he's at Emory, and then in the late 50s, in 1959, he gets an opportunity to go to the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, and that's where the balance of his career in the Midwest is carried out at the University of Illinois in the 60s and into the 70s until he decides to, quote-unquote, retire here in 1976. As a matter of fact, Don Luis has taught more here at UCSB than he's taught in any other previous institution, even though he came here to retire. So we're the beneficiary of his so-called retirement. So again, here throughout the book, as he's talking about his various books and research projects, again, we're talking about also many of the changes in Mexican literature during this period of time. We talk about the boom writers like Fuentes and Cortázar in the 60s and so forth. And it's in the mid to late 1960s that Don Luis begins to shift a bit the trajectory of his career, because it's a period of social movements in the United States, of the protests against the Vietnam War, the beginnings of the Chicano movement and the farm workers with Cesar Chavez here in California. And Don Luis begins to be interested and attracted to the concept of Chicano literature. And in fact, Don Luis will be the first senior scholar in the United States who will champion the concept of Chicano literature, that Chicanos, or Mexican Americans, people of Mexican descent in the United States, have a literature that they have written, and that literature has a deep history going back to the Spanish and Mexican periods of the Southwest. He's one of the early champions of that and begins to write and give papers at conferences. And in a sense, his stature already begins to legitimize the concept of Chicano literature, and we're all very indebted for that. In this section, for example, I ask him about the origins of Chicano literature, and I ask him, Don Luis, in 1973 you published an article entitled Mexican American Literature, A Historical Perspective. In that article you argue that Chicano literature is not just that literature that comes out of the Chicano movement, but that it is a more extensive literature which can be traced as far back as the Spanish colonial period in the Southwest. Why do you think we need to look at Chicano literature in this expansive way? And his response was, I'll try to justify my point of view in this way. First of all, some critics suggest that Chicano literature began with the novel Pocho in 1959 by Villarreal. But even before Pocho, there was a literature that wasn't called Chicano literature because that term wasn't used in that way. We could call it Mexican American literature or pre-Chicano literature. No literature is born out of thin air. Every literature has a background. Before 1959, there are novels, a great deal of poetry, plays, and essays that were written by people of Spanish-Mexican descent. The problem was that no one studied that literature. But why should we omit that literature? When we study American literature, for example, we begin with the landing of the Pilgrims. When we study Mexican literature, we don't say that it was born in 1810 or 1812 or 1821 when Mexico becomes independent. No one would say that Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz is not a Mexican writer because when she wrote Mexico did not exist, but New Spain did. The second point I would make, he continued, is that why should Chicanos give up their literary roots? We should not give up the writers both before and after 1848 when the United States captured the Southwest. In fact, you can go as far back as the explorer Cabeza de Vaca, who wrote about his adventures in Texas in the 16th century. Here are some pictures of Don Luis, again, still in Chicago, working with some of the Mexican civic groups that I forgot to mention. Here he is in Mississippi with one of his colleagues, Professor Strickland, at the University of Illinois. I'm sorry, in Guadalajara, but at the time that he's teaching at the University of Illinois. Here at the University of Illinois. And among the writers that he knew and wrote about and knew for many years Octavio Paz, the great Mexican poet and essayist. And this, in fact, this is a shot when Octavio Paz came to UCSB back in the 80s, and Don Luis was with him. Also with Carlos Fuentes, the great Mexican novelist, and that's a younger Mario Garcia in the back there. This was also in the 80s when we had Carlos Fuentes here as a distinguished Regents lecturer in the Department of Chicano Studies, a week that I will never, never forget, among other things, because my daughter Juliana was born within days of Carlos Fuentes' arrival. And as a matter of fact, Fuentes talked to me on the phone and he said, you know, I don't know what you're going to call your daughter, but I think you should call her Carlota in my honor of coming to UCSB. And I said, well, that's an interesting idea, but I think I'll pass up on that one. Also, he was scheduled to be here for 2 weeks as a Regents. Regents lectures for 2 weeks get a stipend of about $1,000. Fuentes said to me, how much do I get? And I said, you get $1,000 for the 2 weeks. $1,000, he said, I get that for one lecture. So fortunately, we were able to arrange for him to come for 1 week. It was a memorable week. It was very difficult, I must tell you. But nevertheless, it was a great experience, and Don Luis here at a reception for him at the Chancellor's house, I guess it was the Chancellor Hettenbach at that time, was there with him as well. So these are the many writers that he's known over the years and written about. This is when he comes to UCSB in 1976, a little bit later, at the Center for Chicano Studies. In the early 80s, he didn't have to do it, but we were in between directors of the Center for Chicano Studies, and there was some fear that the administration might do away with the center, and Don Luis graciously accepted to come in as acting director, and he was acting director not for 1 year, not for 2 years, but for 3 years, and it was a tremendous benefit for us to, in a transitional period, to have him do that. So he talks about, you know, the origins of Chicano literature, how we should look at Chicano literature, and so forth and so on. And when he comes specifically to UCSB, he begins to now write a lot more about Chicano literature, and begins to deal with people like Tomas Rivera here at a conference that we had here in UCSB back, I believe, in the late 70s or early 80s, with other writers like Rolando Hinojosa from Texas, Don Luis, who actually Don Luis knew back at Illinois because Rolando was a graduate student there at Illinois. Later here with Victor Fuentes, who's now the chair of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, when we had Elena Poniatowska, the great Mexican writer and essayist, also as a Regents lecturer in the Department of Chicano Studies back in the 1880s. This is actually in Don Luis's backyard. Another younger Mario Garcia over to the right, sandwiched between Don Luis and Elena. So with Richard Rodriguez later in the 1980s, we have interesting conversations with Don Luis. For example, let me just quote a little bit about our discussions on Richard Rodriguez, obviously a controversial writer. I asked him, another writer who appears in the early 1980s is Richard Rodriguez, whose autobiography, Hunger of Memory, didn't receive much attention from Chicano critics and in some ways was even boycotted by Chicano studies scholars. His book, however, did receive much national attention. What were your reactions to Hunger of Memory and to Rodriguez as a writer? And Don Luis said, to me, Rodriguez is probably the best writer in English of Chicano literature. His style is impressive. But his ideas are not directed to a Chicano audience, they are directed to the larger community. And as a result, he has some severe critics among Chicanos. Rodriguez is controversial because he has criticized issues such as affirmative action and bilingual education. He has even suggested that there's no such thing as Chicano literature. So naturally, he has received criticism for these positions. However, I think he has changed his views on some of these issues. And then I said, if you put aside the more controversial essays in Hunger of Memory, it is a moving story about identity. And Don Luis says, it's a wonderful story. And he handles English so well. You can disagree with some of Rodriguez's ideas and still enjoy the use of language. As you know, Rodriguez was trained in English literature and uses some of this training to write about pastoral society in his book. Of course, the controversy that went with the book only helped Rodriguez to become better known. Hunger of Memory was the first book written by a Chicano to be reviewed on the front pages of the New York Times Book Review. And this is when Richard Rodriguez came to a standing room audience just a few years ago. And I apologize to Richard, even though I disagree with some of his more controversial ideas, for not having invited him earlier. And he had a tremendous reception, a very positive reception among students who came up and talked to him for well over an hour after his presentation. This is also, in the early 90s, Leonard Wallach mentioned Bert Corona, and some of you, as my students, are reading the oral history that I did of Bert Corona. Don Luis and Bert Corona have known each other for many, many years. Bert Corona is one of the great community and labor leader out of Los Angeles. And Don Luis knew him back in the 60s because his daughter Margot was a student of Don Luis's at the University of Illinois. And this is when Bert Corona came up and we talked about the book that I did with him. There's another section that I want to read and maybe just conclude where we talk about the new Chicano writers. And I asked Don Luis, in the 1980s, Chicano literature is characterized by the growing visibility and importance of women writers, or the new Chicana writers. How do you explain this change? And Don Luis said, I think that it's the fact that before the 1980s, very few Chicanos went to the universities. Some of the Chicano men did, but most women did not. Men, for example, had the advantage of the GI Bill, like I did after World War II, but also after Korea and during Vietnam. Out of this greater movement of Chicano men into higher education from World War II to the 1970s, you get a group of Chicano writers, but very few women writers. It's not until the 1970s and into the 80s that for the first time, important number of Chicanas are in the colleges. Some began to take courses in creative writing and in English and began to write and to publish. Of course, you have some women who are writing essays and poetry for movement periodicals and newspapers, but this is not writing at the level that we would see in the 1980s with writers such as Sandra Cisneros and Ana Castillo. Cisneros and Castillo are both products of a university education. Some of these emerging women writers out of the 1970s also began to form groups and association of women writers. They encourage each other to write and to publish. Some even published their own literary journals, such as Mango, published by Lorna de Cervantes here in California. You can see that by the early 80s that Chicano literature was changing from a largely male-dominated field to one, at least in the novel and short story, dominated by women. So we talk about some of these writers like Cisneros and Ana Castillo. One of the last questions that I asked him in the book was, as you look at Chicano literature today, what would you say have been the most important developments? And his response was, that's a difficult question. One very positive development has been the emergence of women writers since the 1980s. Another is a discovery of earlier pre-Chicano movement writers so that we have a sense of a literary heritage. Still another is the evolution from poetry to fiction during and after the Chicano movement. Finally, I would say is the important flowering of Chicano literary criticism. And then the last question I asked him, do you see a positive future for Chicano literature? And he said, definitely. We'll continue to have more and better writers and critics. Let me just conclude and present Don Luis by in my introduction, I write that that during 6 decades of research and writing, a career that's still ongoing at the end of the millennium, Don Luis has exhibited certain key characteristics as a scholar that I believe serve as an outstanding example for the rest of us. First, he has always seen his research not in isolation from the community or from social issues, but as very much of a part of a dialogue on how to advance the interests of the community. He has seen his research as a way of better understanding human relations and of promoting social justice. That is the humanist and the citizen in Don Luis. To this end, he has always attempted to study literature and writers within a historical context. For Don Luis, literature does not exist outside of history, but is a part of history and the making of history. His interdisciplinary orientation, even in his earlier years when the term was not even yet in vogue, has been indicative of his non-traditional approach. He is a scholar who understands the complexity of the world and of the intricacies of human social relationships, which are not subject to easy judgments. Perhaps his most exemplary characteristic as a scholar is his sense of tolerance and support for the work of others. As he told me more than once in our conversations, everyone contributes something. Every scholar produces some useful knowledge that is of benefit to other scholars. Discouraging elitist and ego-driven competition among academics through his work and his example, Don Luis has encouraged a humanistic tolerance among the scholarly community. In this day of one-upmanship in the academy, Don Luis's kind and gentle approach is a refreshing alternative. I also mentioned in the book that the important thing about Don Luis's life is not how long a life he has had, but how he has lived his life. That's the importance. And with that, it's my great privilege and honor to introduce Professor Luis Leal to you.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. After everything that Mario has said, there's nothing left for me to add. So I thought about this, and what I'm going to do is just touch here and there some points that perhaps are not in the book. First, I want to thank Mario for having published this autobiography, which really is a dialogue between him and I. And I also want to thank Professors Ellen McCracken for the help she gave us in preparing the book, and to my wife, Gladys, without whose help I could never have reached this far in my career. And I also want to thank Dean Donnerstein for his work in the social sciences. In my life, I have been able to earn my living and enjoy my career at the same time. That career has been a long one. But since the beginning, I was fortunate to have received tenure at my first position at the University of Mississippi, since I had already published books and articles before receiving my doctorate at Chicago. While at Mississippi, I was able to publish two of my most successful books, México, Civilizaciones y Culturas, in 1955, and my Breve Historia del Cuento Mexicano in 1956. The Mexico book was used widely in high schools and colleges and taught many of the readers the history and culture of Mexico. In the second edition of 1971, which came out when I was teaching at Middlebury College in Vermont, I included a chapter on Chicano culture. the first publication on the subject, my first publication on the subject, where I already have a picture of Cesar Chavez. My book on the history of the Mexican short story, which was the result of having written my doctoral dissertations on the origins of the Mexican short story, was very successful in Mexico, since it was the first on the subject. In 1996, to celebrate the 40th anniversary of that publication, Professor Sara Pot Herrera organized the symposium dedicated to this genre and invited critics and writers of short stories from Mexico. About 20 of them attended and read their criticisms or their own original stories. But to my surprise, during the ceremony, a book with these lectures and these short stories was presented to me, published by the National University of Mexico. Usually, it takes 2 or 3 years before books on meetings of this kind come out. After Mississippi, on to Emory University, and in 1959, to the University of Illinois, where I made use of their prestigious library, where I directed over 40 doctoral dissertations. I retired in 1976 and came here. But at Illinois, in 1973, at the request of Luis Davila from Indiana University, I wrote the article, Mexican-American Literature, A Historical Perspective, which was published in the first number of the Revista Chicano Riqueña, and which became very popular because, for the first time, the space of Chicano literature was extended to the colonial period. This year, 2000, Illinois gave me a doctorate honoris causa. My coming to UCSB in '76 was due mainly to the efforts of Professor Winston Reynolds and Mireya Jaimes Freire. She appears in one of the photographs that Mario showed. They played a large part in my decision to accept the offer of visiting professor, which I am still holding after 24 years. I call myself a permanent visiting professor. After a year at UCLA, I was invited by Fernando de Necochea, director of the Center for Chicano Studies, to join it as a senior researcher. It was then also that I met Mario. I still remember meeting him when I was going to the library, between Phelps Hall and the library. He was already here. Later, when he became chair of the department, he asked me to join it. I believe that the decision I made in '76 to come to UCSB was the right one. For these years, these 24 years have been some of my happiest ones. Having colleagues and friends such as Mario, Ellen McCracken, Victor Fuentes, Francisco Lomelí, Maria Herrera Sobek, Denise Segura, Ray Huerta, and many, many others. These years have also been my most productive, especially in the field of Chicano studies. And I have enjoyed teaching Chicanos and Chicanas students their cultural literary background. I want to thank all of you who have been so supportive of me and who have honored me so many times. Muchas gracias.